In August of 2017, 7 blokes set out on an epic adventure to cross the Simpson Desert by motorcycle. We all knew it would be a challenge, but what we didn't know is despite all our preparation, one of us would not make it to the finish line. Let's meet the gang. First up, from the mid-north coast, we have my dad, Craig. Legendary amongst his peers for taking his TDM 900 just about anywhere. Dad left the TDM in the stable for the trip across the desert and brought along his 20-year-old WR400 instead. He claimed that the WR was probably going to break down, but it didn't worry him as he wouldn't hesitate to abandon it in the desert. Next we have the men from the Northern Rivers, Jeff, Glenn and Simon. You'd be forgiven for thinking they were Team Suzuki, sporting 2 DRZ 400s and a DR 650. Whilst each of them were accomplished riders, we had to keep an eye on Glenn, as he was known for paying too much attention to the cattle on the side of the road instead of watching where he was going. Then we have the Victorian boys Shane and Ian. Having been loyal to his road riding for many years, Shane recently decided the dirt was where the true adventure is. He is attempting to tame the KTM 500 on this trip across the desert. Ian is by far the most experienced desert rider out of all of us, having completed several unsupported crossings of the Simpson in recent years. Wanting to share the experience with others, Ian decided to swap the handlebars for a steering wheel and help support us across the desert. Lastly, there is me, from Brisbane. I'll be riding my GS 800 and taking photos where I can. Since we live all over the country, the nominated starting point was Maree in South Australia. It took most of us about 3 days of driving to get there, and we were all busting to get onto the bikes. Day 1 of the ride saw us unload the bikes and set about packing Ian's ute with everything we'd need.
Right, Shane, where are we off to?
Well, we're off to Mungareni, then Birdsville.
Good one.
Beautiful day.
You happy, Jeff?
I'm ecstatic.
Glenn?
Never happy.
Simon?
Never happy. Betcha.
Murray's always ready. And Craig's way over here. Staying close to the support.
Yeah.
Rightio.
The old story.
Yep. Get on your bikes and get going then.
We set off up the Birdsville track with the goal of making camp just north of Mungareni. It wasn't too far down the road and we had our first mechanical issue. The KTM had decided to eat its own number plate. We were starting to get into some harsh environment, so it was important to help each other out where possible.
What do you want?
There's a lever here that pulls my sun visor down.
Yeah, up a bit. You're getting warmer. Down a bit. Down a bit. Nah, cross. Nah, hold on.
With our minds fully set on the task of crossing the desert, it wasn't long before the small sand dunes on the side of the road became a tempting opportunity to polish our sand riding skills. The temperature was starting to rise, and we had worked up a sweat in the sand. We made a beeline for the Mungareni pub.
We're at Mungareni. Just fueled up. Got a few beers sunk. On our way to Birdsville.
After enjoying the hospitality of the pub, we jumped on the bikes and headed up the road another 100k or so to try and find a place to camp. That evening, as we rehydrated ourselves at the campsite, we thought about tomorrow's destination, Big Red. Many of us were wondering what it would be like to ride the iconic dune. We exchanged sand riding tips, hoping our talent might catch up with our ambition.
No, I reckon go back off. Go a bit off. Power through it. Accelerate through it.
The next morning we packed up and jumped back on the bikes. We were pretty eager to get to Birdsville, which was just 200 k's up the Birdsville track. I was pretty keen to get into a camel pie from the bakery. Our arrival in Birdsville marked the end of the warm-up section of the journey and the beginning of the true desert experience. After setting up our camp, we headed out to Big Red for a look around.
Big Red, there she is. That's her.
After working up a sweat on the dune, we all enjoyed a refreshing beer on top of Big Red before heading back to Birdsville. Day 3 of the ride was our first day in the desert. We grabbed our supplies and headed west for the dunes. The thought of facing more than 1,000 dunes before seeing civilization again was daunting. The consequences of having an injury or a breakdown in the desert are high. The time for preparation was over, and the time for enjoying the ride was upon us.
Got her up.
The landscape was continually changing, but the track was relentlessly sandy. We set a steady pace, allowing time to adjust to the riding conditions.
Just making some minor adjustments.
Bit of trackside maintenance.
Bit of trackside, mate. How's it going so far there, Glenn? No worries? And what about you, Murray? All good?
Yeah, getting the big girls free.
It's like a little duck flapping those little wings. Here comes Craig. Yeehaw! Followed by Simon. Oh, Muzz, Muzz, Muzz! Holy shit, what's happened there? Just copped that on camera too. Yeah.
temperature rose, the sand became looser and less forgiving. With temps in the low 30s, we pushed on to arrive at a dry lake bed just inside the Northern Territory by mid-afternoon. We had been stopping regularly to rest and regroup. But after Ian hadn't arrived for half an hour, we knew something had gone wrong. We couldn't hail Ian on the small radios, so Jeff rode back to make contact.
We just had a puncture.
The ute had suffered a large puncture on the sidewall of a rear tyre. Ian had managed to plug it and was driving cautiously. The tyre plugs used on the large hole were surprisingly holding for now, but a decision on whether we could continue on our trip was needed. We still had around 700 k's of desert and dirt tracks to cover before we could replace a tyre in Alice Springs. Glenn had painstakingly prepared us some bush tucker, sourced from the Birdsville Servo. The assembly of the humble sausage sanger came with strict instructions to get the best result.
Now you put the knife back over, that's the boy, and then use the other thing to get a bit of onion. And sauce is over there, and brother, you're in business.
Oh, did he do it right, Glenn, or not?
So far, so good.
Must have done a fantastic job.
We took stock of our tyre repair supplies and decided to continue only if the damaged tyre was able to hold air overnight. Day 2 in the desert. We awoke to find the tyre was still holding air, so we pushed on. After a short ride down the edge of the dry lake bed, we arrived at Popel's Corner. From Popel's Corner, we started along the French line. The track became rough and more demanding. The sand dunes got closer together, leaving little time for rest. With the temperature a little bit cooler than previous days, we made good progress. We turned south down the Knowles track and took a break for lunch. Once we got going again, the conditions began to take their toll.
What's going on here, Glenn?
We're just swapping over Muzz's gear lever
Why is that?
because a rock caught it.
That might be one of these ones back here. That one beside Craig's bag.
Yeah, probably that one.
Yeah.
One before the rock. The gear lever just kept a rock. Okay? It's in the bottom and fall over.
So Shane, where are we?
We're in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
We're somewhere south of
Nobody can pronounce the name, but we'll call it the Knowles anyway.
Knowles, that's
Yeah.
it.
Okay.
Beautiful weather.
And our two front runners have gone and left us yet again.
And our two guys at the front have disappeared. They'll be down the track somewhere waiting for us.
Good. Thanks for that, Shane.
As the day went on, I found myself making more and more mistakes. Sometimes just stopping on the middle of the track was enough to bog the GS up to the axle. The dunes started to grow again, and the sand got deeper and loose like soup. Any slight lapse in judgment was punished by having to manhandle the bikes.
Caught me and Simon by surprise. We had to paddle up. Yeah. Couldn't. Run up.
Where are we going? Come on, this'll do.
Even the four-wheel drive was having some difficulties. This particular sand dune required 4 attempts to get the vehicle up the rutted and twisty climb.
She's a cracker.
Probably already been up this hill.
Yeah, probably, yeah. We got the revs going now.
Right. When we made camp that night, we set about mending the Beamer's gear lever.
Probably work.
Go on then.
Moses got to decide that because it's his bike.
Good, you know what I mean?
You can hit that with a hammer on the reverse
Yeah, you
side.
get it with the hammer. Or if you don't want to touch it at all, put it straight on because you're still going to get your foot under there
Yeah.
and change the gears.
You can put it on and you can nearly...
Day 3 in the desert, and half of the guys went for a quick detour to see the Lone Gum before we continued along the WAA line.
All that way, 18 k's. At least a couple of birds have got their nest in it. Oh yeah. There's 3 nests. Nah.
What have we got, Craig? Another Suzuki problem?
Another yellow demon's gone down.
Steel jerry cans. Chef.
He's got filters on this, and every time we fill it out, it's
He took one look at those little jerry cans and put them on, I suppose, did he? Glenn, what do you think of this show?
I never want to come in the first place.
By mid-morning, the sand had once again turned into a fine slurry that was very difficult at times. Every now and again, we would be faced with a significantly larger dune. Although they were extremely difficult to climb, our time in the saddle had given us plenty of practice by now. We had managed to make good progress, and despite all the minor mishaps, so far nobody had been injured. That was until about midday, when we faced another large sand dune without any cameras rolling. Simon had managed to ride up the dune, but came to a stop in a precarious position. He and his DR fell over, and the barkbuster landed on his forearm and had badly broken several bones. After a group discussion considering all our options, we decided the best course of action was to continue west. We had spotted an airfield on a map, not too far away. If it was suitable for an aircraft, we could then use our satellite phone to call for help. Fortunately, Simon was still able to drive the manual four-wheel drive, and Ian was now piloting the DR650. We were now on the rig road, and the conditions improved considerably. We were making good pace when suddenly we had tyre issues again. The plugs had finally let go. With another quick dose of tyre plugs, we were back on the move. We arrived at the airfield. We attempted to measure the length of the airstrip, which was now hosting sections of shrubbery. The longest clear section was only 300 metres or so, not enough to land or take off in a plane. Plan B was to continue on to Dalhousie Springs, but that meant camping another night in the desert, as we were running out of light. We made camp just as we got back onto the French line.
The old 400, she's got no towing capability.
Taking the 630.
Doing the best I can with what I got.
Alright.
There's only space for one. This is a one-man camp, mate. This thing off over the other side.
It's not very neighbourly.
Day 4 in the desert. We focused on getting Simon back to civilization. We made a beeline for Dalhousie Springs. We had made it across the Simpson. We took a quick dip in the hot pools to celebrate, and Simon received some fresh first aid from a good Samaritan. We put the call into the emergency authorities and scheduled to meet the Royal Flying Doctors at Mount Dare, just a few hours down the road. The sand had all but given way to rocky and corrugated tracks. Keeping a steady pace, we made it to Mount Dare with time for one more beer before Simon's plane arrived.
You didn't tell me you had a personal jet.
We made arrangements to leave Simon's bike at Mount Dare, where we could attempt to recover it later on. As Simon was whisked away on his flight to Alice Springs with the Royal Flying Doctor Service, it was a stark reminder of how risky a crossing of the desert can be, and how easily it could have been a lot worse. After a late start, we headed off up the Bins track. We were now just 450 k's from Alice Springs, and we were all looking forward to some creature comforts. Whilst the riding wasn't as difficult as the desert sand, There were large patches of bull dust to keep everyone on their toes.
Right, Murray, it's your birthday, your 31st. What do you think of this?
Oh, this is pretty good.
One of the better birthdays you've had?
Oh yeah, it's certainly unique.
That's good. You had to say that, didn't you? Well, that's good. Happy birthday.
I thought it was good. I didn't have to buy him a present down here.
We made camp along the track and soaked up the stars. A few snags we picked up from Mount Dare went down a treat. It was a short ride into town the next morning. We set up camp for 2 nights at the caravan park and set about replacing the damaged tyre on the ute. We paid a visit to Simon, who had now been in Alice Springs Hospital for a few nights. Simon's hand was not in a good way, but he was still in good spirits. Simon would not be able to continue with us on the trip, and he was scheduled to fly back to the East Coast. Although we had successfully crossed the Simpson, we still had a long and interesting ride before the journey was over. We bid farewell to Alice Springs and set off on the final leg of the journey. We headed for Fink, the home of the iconic off-road race. Some of us took the opportunity to ride the very track that has forged legends like Toby Price. The harsh off-road track encounters some breathtaking scenery as it follows the path of the old Garn Railway. We headed for Mount Dare to pick up Simon's bike. The Northern Rivers men, being the masters of fabrication, had prepared an emergency bike towing device, affectionately dubbed the Cradle of Death. The device had been carried across the desert with the intent that it never be needed, but the Cradle of Death was needed. And surprisingly, it worked. Well, mostly. As long as sharp turns could be avoided, the bike in tow remained well composed. We found a nice spot near the Aringa waterhole to camp for the night. The next day marked the 11th day since we had left the vehicles back in Maree. We headed south to meet up with the Oodnadatta track. That night we enjoyed the company of a busload of backpackers at Williams Creek. The last day of the ride was a short stint down the Oodnadatta track to Maree. The temperature was in the low single digits, which made for a bitterly cold start in the morning. But it wasn't long before we found ourselves pulling into Maree, marking the end of an incredible adventure. We had crossed the Simpson Desert and lived to tell the tale.
So we made it back to Maree, Glen, having the celebratory sausage roll.
Injury free.
Injury free, mechanicals free.
Surprising. I'm happy that I did it.
WR made it all the way.
Yeah, go again, I think.
And Ian's played tow truck for the last 650 odd Ks.
Yeah.
And
Awkward bunch of people I've ever known in my life. No, everybody got through. It's good.
Outstanding job.
You knew what you were getting into.
What are you doing? Long stroke. Long stroke.
Long stroke.
Use your shoulders.
Long stroke.
Yeah, keep going.
Long stroke, baby. You can do it. Come on.
You've got good form.
Long stroke.
Do you want to spell?
That's it.
Is it? Is that all you got?
That's all I got.
Okay.